welcome back to this introduction to India and South Asia. I'm Benjamin Siegel, and I'm thrilled to have you back with me today. Today, we're going to go through one of the biggest events of world history in the 20th century, the partition of India into the Republic of India and the new nation-state of Pakistan in 1947. And afterwards, we're going to follow the trajectory of one of those countries, the Republic of India, into its first decade and a half of independence. Afterwards, we're going to come back and look what happened in both West and East Pakistan. Last time we talked, we left off with the British Cabinet mission plan for India. It was one that offered a federated plan with three different parts to it. Muhammad Ali Jinnah of the Muslim League had accepted the idea, but Congress and Nehru were convinced that it didn't offer them enough for state-building purposes, and so they rejected it. This put Jinnah into a real quandary. He couldn't have his Pakistan of groups that he had once imagined, and he was beginning to feel desperate. And now it seemed that he was going to have to accept that moth-eaten Pakistan that he had previously rejected. Jinnah needed to convince the Congress that he was serious. He wanted to show that he couldn't be pushed aside in any kind of final settlement. And so he made a call that had an unfortunate outcome. Jinnah called in 1946 for direct action in support of Pakistan. And in doing so, he unleashed a torrent of violence. In some ways, this was a little bit of a sneak preview of what would happen in partition itself. Jinnah's call for direct action led to the Great Calcutta Killing. It took place from the 16th to the 20th of August, 1946. Mobs roamed the streets of Calcutta. Some 4,000 people, both Hindus and Muslims, were killed, and thousands more were either wounded or made homeless. Then shortly afterwards, 7,000 Muslims were killed in the province of Bihar, and in Noakhali in Bengal, a lesser number of Hindus were killed. It doesn't seem that Jinnah's intent was to provoke violence, but passions had become inflamed, and it seemed that only if Gandhi was physically present in a community as he went from time to time, no one would be able to control the crowds and steer them away from violence. Things were also bad in Western India, in Punjab. Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League had won the election, but he was outraged that the Muslim League had to go into a coalition government with the Congress and the Akali Sikhs there. And so in March of 1947, Jinnah led a campaign of civil disobedience that brought down the state government in Punjab. Afterwards, there were riots, and again they were giving a hint of what would happen later in 1947. Riots took place around Lahore and the holy city of Amritsar. It centered in many ways around Sikhs who were deeply opposed to the idea of partition. They were worried that in any kind of partition they would be brought into a new Pakistan, and they distrusted or were fearful of what might happen to them under a Muslim government. They were also worried that a partition might split Punjab into two. Sikhs were already a small minority community, and it seemed that splitting apart primarily Hindu and Muslim districts in this province would separate them from their co-religionists. It seemed that northwest India and eastern India were sinking into chaos. And so the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee appointed Lord Mountbatten as the new viceroy. Mountbatten was young, he was charming, and he was deeply sympathetic to Indian nationalists. And he had instructions that he was to transfer power to Indians no later than June of 1948. But this was a date that soon would be moved up to August 15th, 1947. And that should give you a sense that the British at this point were very desperate to leave. The Conservatives back in Britain denounced this idea of leaving India in a rush, but Britain was already in economic crisis. Its post-war austerity was growing worse and worse, and so there was really a strong incentive at home for a rapid transfer to a successor government or successor governments who might be able to restore order. The clock was ticking, and Lord Mountbatten had to make a lot of decisions very quickly. Would power be handed over to 2, 3 states, more successor states? It was clear that there was going to be at least an India and a Pakistan, and so where would that boundary be? No one had any idea at this point in time what was going to happen to the princely states, who were linked directly to the crown but had no clear connection to the Indian constitutional order itself. By the time Lord Mountbatten arrived in India, there probably was no real chance of a united India, but it really wasn't clear that there was only going to be 2 successor states either. In the plan that Lord Mountbatten initially came up with, he proposed transferring power to the different provinces. They could each join India, Pakistan, or remain independent. Nehru, of course, was upset by this plan, and he was able to get Mountbatten to agree to hand over power directly by appealing to the terms of the 1935 Government of India Act. The idea was that there would be two dominions, all part of the Commonwealth, and that would smooth the transition into independent rule. The nation was cut up. It was divided surgically by a young bureaucrat named Cyril Radcliffe, who was charged with dividing around 175,000 square miles of territory containing 88 million different people. This came to a head on August 15, 1947, when Jawaharlal Nehru stood up in the Parliament chamber and he announced in this famous speech that India had finally claimed its freedom.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially.
The next morning, Nehru repeated some of these words on the ramparts of Shah Jahan's historic Red Fort. Keep in mind that the Red Fort was the last holdout of the Mughal Empire, and it was also where the Sikh and the Hindu and the Muslim representatives of the Indian National Army had been tried just 2 years before. 3 days earlier, Muhammad Ali Jinnah had made his own independence speech for Pakistan. He told the citizens of this new Muslim state that you are free. You are free to go to your temples. You are free to go to your mosques or any other place of worship in this state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion or caste or creed, and that has nothing to do with the business of the state. This was an incredible moment. It was the end of 200 or more years of empire. But all that celebration was soon to be disfigured and stained by the horrors of partition. It's still a pretty controversial debate as to whether or not Lord Mountbatten's decision to speed up the transfer of power had something to do in creating the violence that came afterwards. There's an argument that said that if the British had only stayed on for a couple more years, they had set up transitional institutions, they had put the army in place beforehand, then maybe they could have come up with some kind of peaceable transfer to governments that would be better prepared to maintain order. But some historians also argue that it was the shock treatment of an early transfer that made India's politicians stop talking and to accept responsibility for a growing disorder that Britain really had no ability to contain at this point. The first outbreaks of violence and partition came in March 1947. They took place in the Muslim-majority West Punjab as Muslims attacked Hindu and Sikh residents of the area. As independence came closer and closer, violence spread throughout Punjab, and it caught up all communities, especially the Sikhs, who saw their lands, their shrines, and their holy places all divided in two by the Radcliffe Line and the Boundary Award. Sometimes the violence of partition is described as a mindless orgy of violence, where overnight villagers who had been friends living in communities side by side began to murder and rape those people who had formerly been their friends. Increasingly, we don't think that's true. We know that Punjab was a highly militarized society. It had long been recruiting grounds for the Indian Army, and around a third of eligible males had served in the Second World War. So Punjab was filled with demobilized, well-trained soldiers. It seems like many of those former soldiers took advantage of their military training and knowledge and the modern weapons that they had access to organize and direct attacks. Former Indian Army and Indian National Army men formed out into mobile bands called Jathas. They marked out targets and they carried out raids into Muslim-majority villages. Muslims also attacked Hindus. Men forced women to jump into wells to preserve their purity and fought to the end themselves. A lot of the violence of partition took place on trains. These were trains carrying refugees across the borders, and they were tempting targets for all sides. Many refugees were ambushed, train cars were derailed, and people were murdered in the compartments or on the tracks. Trains would sometimes arrive at destinations carrying hundreds of dead bodies, and the arrival of each train of horrors would provoke a cry for vengeance or revenge from the aggrieved community. We don't have a clear sense of the lives lost in partition. There's estimates that are as low as several 100,000, and they go up all the way to 1 million and more. But maybe even worse than the actual death toll was the fear among survivors that one could only trust their own community of Hindus, of Muslims, of Sikhs. This was a really important factor in consolidating loyalty towards that new state, either the Republic of India or Pakistan, the idea that only one of those places could serve as a secure haven. And that idea was particularly important for Pakistan, where the idea of a haven for India's Muslims now had become a political reality. This migration was the biggest in South Asia, and it was probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, migration in human history. About 5 million Hindus and Sikhs moved from West Punjab into Pakistan, and about 5.5 million Muslims went in the opposite direction. This is something that, by today's standards, we would call ethnic cleansing. It produced an Indian Punjab that was around 60% Hindu, 35% Sikh, and 5% Muslim, while Pakistani Punjab in the West became almost completely Muslim. There was a similar extent of migration between East and West Bengal, though the loss of life in those provinces were less extensive. In Delhi, the city's Muslims cowered in an old fort, and they were regarded for months after partition with great suspicion and tremendous hostility. Partition in total probably uprooted and resettled at least 12.5 million of undivided India's people. Across the border, both governments were trying to establish themselves in office. They were trying to control the violence, and they were doing so with surprising speed. In most cases, violence was really brought under control by the end of 1947. And in many ways, if there was success, it was because there were very strong, resilient structures left over from the colonial state. British officials didn't stay on in India, but they did actually stay on for a bit in Pakistan because the state had to set up a central government from scratch. But both states had disciplined armies, dedicated civil servants, and they set to work with the big projects of independence, organizing the resettlement of refugees and recapturing authority and legitimacy for themselves. They did this in ways that were sometimes mundane, just by issuing passports or documents for the new state. The state was weakened by partition, but it never really collapsed, and that resiliency helped to smooth over many of the transitions that were occurring at the same time. Many people wanted to see more revolutionary changes at independence, peasant movements, communist movements, but generally speaking, the more conservative Congress and Muslim League politicians were able to hold the fort. There was one important question that remained. What would happen to the hundreds of princely states that were scattered across the subcontinent? Lord Mountbatten told the princes that they couldn't expect any help or support from Britain, and he urged them to make the best possible terms and arrangements they could with the new regimes that they would now potentially be a part of. The new governments didn't want to see India become balkanized or divided up into too many small parts. India's princely governors didn't want to see their states and countries disappear from the map, and so they pleaded for better time and better terms. But they didn't really have any bargaining power over the powerful central government, particularly in India. In India, that task of incorporating the princely states was given over to Vallabhbhai Patel and his aide, VP Menon. At first, all they wanted was for the states to accede to the Indian Union, and only afterwards did they ask for a complete administrative merger into the Republic of India. To sweeten the deal, they offered privy purses or allowances to the former princes themselves. And so it was a combination of carrots and sticks. There were threats and intimidation. There was often the ultimatum to hand over power within days or even hours. And it meant that very quickly the Indian princely states were incorporated into the Republic of India. There were a couple of princely states, though, that held out a little bit longer. One of the most important was Hyderabad, which is a large and populous state. The Nizam, or ruler of Hyderabad, was a Muslim, and he had opted for independence, and he sought to enforce that independence by an irregular army that he recruited from the Muslim aristocracy living in the state. But he couldn't really compete against the army of the Republic of India. His state was surrounded by India, the bulk of his subjects were Hindus, and his army was makeshift, and it couldn't really even maintain order in his own state. So in September 1948, the Indian army moved into Hyderabad, and it took over one of the most important sites of Islamic culture and learning in the Deccan in central South India. There was an even harder question up north in Kashmir, which had a Hindu Maharaja. Kashmir was pretty far away from the central Indian plains. It was up in the high mountains. It was the only state that shared a border with both India and Pakistan, and so its ruler theoretically could join either. But the Maharaja didn't know what to do. He went back and forth. But after an invasion by the Pakistani army, he felt like his hand was forced. In October 1947, he agreed to accede Kashmir to India, and this began a conflict that's lasted just as long as India's independence. Kashmir wasn't a particularly important place for mineral resources or anything else. It didn't even really matter that it was the original home of the Nehru family. but it was a site that raised issues central to India and Pakistan's self-conception as new nations. For Pakistan, it was enough to say that Kashmir had an overwhelmingly Muslim population. The decision that the Maharaja would join India flew in the face of the logic that had led to India's partition, since Pakistan was supposed to be a Muslim homeland. Even though many Muslims remained scattered across India, Kashmir, as a Muslim-majority state, seemed like it would have rightly belonged to Pakistan. Over the next 25 years, Pakistan would fight at least 3 wars with India. They would secure in 1948 a portion of western Kashmir, together with the northern regions of Gilgit and Baltistan, but they were never able to gain possession of the Srinagar Valley, one of the most culturally and politically important centers of Kashmir. This conflict went straight up to the new United Nations, and they sent policemen and observers to watch this line of control separating the countries. Kashmir meant something else to Nehru and other Indian leaders. They had never accepted the idea of there being 2 nations in India. India wasn't Hindustan, and the Congress leadership insisted that their state was the legitimate successor of the British Raj. The state, of course, was called India. Congress and Nehru believed that India wasn't just the successor to the Raj, but also a secular state where Muslims and all other minorities could live on equal footing with their Hindu co-citizens. There were millions of Muslims living throughout India, and Kashmir would only add to the inclusive vision of the new state. Nehru promised at the time that the Maharaja agreed to join Kashmir with India that India would eventually hold a plebiscite or a referendum that would let Kashmiris decide their own fate. But that hasn't taken place even 70 plus years after Indian independence. There were other major issues that partition brought out in terms of national identity. The widespread abduction of women had become a major issue in between the new states of India and Pakistan. In Punjab, women had been carried off across the border like trophies. Sometimes they were sold or abandoned, forced to marry their abductors. Somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 women were abducted across the borders. And in late 1947, one of the first things that the 2 governments did was they agreed to work together to locate abducted women so that they could be returned to the nation who they were supposed to belong to. There was a lot invested in the idea of returning women, if not to their own families who sometimes didn't want them back, to at least their national homes. This logic didn't always take account of the wishes and desires of women themselves. But that didn't seem to matter much to the governments, and they continued a policy of forced repatriation until 1954. There have been countless books written and films produced about the trauma of partition, and sometimes it's hard for us, looking back from the present day, to realize that this kind of national trauma wasn't talked about for many decades after independence. It took almost 40 years until the 1980s and 1990s for stories of partition and its traumas to really come out. That's thanks in part to historians who paid attention to memory, to oral histories, and to what people were willing to talk about after so much time had elapsed. What happened during partition was essential to nation building in both India and Pakistan, but it took a long time for these scars to fade and for people to be able to reckon with them. For many, those scars have never really faded. This remains a live trauma in many people's lifetime. It's turned into something now that can be capitalized upon in films and TV commercials. But we should never lose sight of what a major trauma 1947 was. There's one event that we can think of as the end of partition, and maybe even the end of colonial India symbolically, and the beginning of a new phase in South Asian history. On January 30th, 1948, as he was leaving a prayer meeting, Gandhi was shot point blank by a man named Nathuram Godse. Gandhi cried out, "Hey Ram," or "Oh God," and then died. Godse was a Hindu nationalist, and the politics behind that killing are something that we'll talk about later. But Gandhi's death stunned the nation, and it was thrown into grief. Nehru told India in a radio broadcast that the light has gone out of our lives. There is darkness everywhere. Gandhi's assassination provoked an incredible sense of loss and trauma, though it's important for us to remember that Gandhi had become increasingly marginal to the Indian political scene ever since the end of the Second World War. He had let Nehru take the initiative in questions of policy and administration, letting him serve first in the interim government and then as prime minister. But Gandhi was deeply wounded by the prospect of partition. He stood aside and refused to take place in the negotiations that brought it about. He was desperate to avoid the partition of India. He had even suggested that Muhammad Ali Jinnah be installed as the Prime Minister of a united India. This was a ridiculous proposal, and it was met simply with silence. Later, he argued that the Congress had accomplished its mission and it should just simply dissolve itself. Again, not a realistic proposal. In the last years of his life, he had made some really fascinating, compelling decisions. He was dedicated to quelling the violence of partition. Just before his death, he intervened once in the political process. He prayed and fasted to force India's Ministry of Revenue to hand over to Pakistan its share of cash from undivided India, about 40 million pounds sterling. But Gandhi at independence was out of the picture, and his assassination in 1948 in January really closed the door on the period of colonial history. So here we are at independence. We've gone through around 200 years of Indian history, from the first moments that the British began to collect revenue in Bengal to this moment when the British packed their bags and left. We followed a pretty chronological story, and it would have been possible to tell it other ways, thinking about things like power, caste, religion, literature, ethnicity, or politics. But we're going to shift focus here. For the rest of today, we're going to follow the trajectory of the Republic of India, talking about some of the things that happened as the world's largest democracy embarked upon this amazing experiment. Afterwards, we're going to see what happened in the new country of Pakistan and in Bangladesh. And after that, we're going to move on to some bigger questions about development, democracy, and caste, and how they've changed in South Asia over the course of the 20th and 21st century. So let's go right back to the Republic of India. There was a big question of how India was going to govern itself when it became independent in August 1947. And that question was hashed out during a series of intense debates in a constituent assembly that met between 1947 and 1949. There was a small group of India's leaders who met in Delhi to establish the set of principles and institutions that would govern it. And these are principles that have broadly stayed in place until the present day. In the Constituent Assembly debates, Nehru tried to create a modern free India. He wanted a big break from the colonial past. India decided that it would remain a member of the Commonwealth, but it proclaimed that it would be a republic, and so it would end its alliance to the British Crown. On January 26, 1950, India became a republic. There was a massive parade in New Delhi, and Republic Day remains an important celebration for India even today. The new Constitution of India, the longest constitution in the world, put into place a Westminster style of government. There would be a parliament with two houses, and a prime minister selected by the majority people in the lower house, called the Lok Sabha, or the House of the People. Nehru became the first prime minister, and there was also the office of the president, which acted like the sovereign in Britain, a head of state without any real formal powers. There were a lot of things that were kept over from the colonial regime. 200 articles of the Indian Constitution were kept over from the Government of India Act of 1935. There was that federal structure where power was shared between the center and the provinces, which were now states, and that stayed intact as well. And so too did the imperial power that had been given to the provincial governor to set aside elected ministries during times of what he believed were emergencies. These powers were used pretty frequently in independent India, mostly at the state level, though once at an all-India level with very important consequences, and we're going to come back to that later. Almost all of the ideas of government in India were taken from British precedent, but there was one major idea which came from America. That was the idea of a Supreme Court, which would conduct the regular judicial review of Indian legislation. Remember that there had been other options on the table too. Gandhi had suggested that there be a kind of non-party government with a weak center and power diffused among self-governing villages. But that wasn't even remotely considered. No one, after Gandhi's death, really thought that India was going to be modeled on some fantastical vision of its ancient past. Nearly everyone agreed that India needed to be a democratic land, with universal suffrage and freedom of the press and speech. But there were big disagreements over how India would protect the voices and interests of its minorities. One of the most important of these minorities, of course, were India's untouchables. And the Congress Party took major steps to ensure that these minorities would have a voice in the new constitutional order. Maybe the most important move that India made was appointing the distinguished Dalit leader B.R. Ambedkar as chair of the drafting committee for the Constitution. Ambedkar was a graduate of Columbia University, and if we remember, he had disagreed bitterly with Gandhi throughout his life. Gandhi had essentially wanted the social structure of caste to remain intact, but Ambedkar had a much more radical vision. He called Hinduism a chamber of horrors, and he argued that all Gandhi had done was to smoothen its surface and give it the appearance of decency and respectability. Right before his death in 1956, B.R. Ambedkar went so far as to convert to Buddhism, formally repudiating Hinduism as a religion and an ideology. The new constitution, which Ambedkar mostly wrote, outlawed the practice of untouchability. Most importantly, in the longer term, it also reserved seats in the legislature for former untouchables, including members of tribes and forest dwellers. These groups, to whom special protection would be afforded, were listed on a special schedule in the Constitution, and so they became known as India's scheduled castes or tribes. The members of these groups stood for election in regular constituencies, and only they could serve as candidates in them. The state didn't want to use colonial-style electorates, but secured untouchable or Dalit inclusion in the legislature itself. Over time, the scope of reservations grew to include preferential access to educational institutions as well as the Indian administrative services. That would open up a lot of demands from other groups. The new state was vocally committed to the principles of secularism and socialism. Despite the predominance of Hindus in its membership, Congress had always proclaimed that it first and foremost was a secular organization. Nehru was equally determined that India should be a secular state. In the 1940s and the 1950s, this was a widely accepted principle. Nehru took a lot of care to separate religion and the state. He used the lion capital of the Buddhist ruler Ashoka as the central device of the country's flag and currency, rather than adopting a Hindu icon or even the Gandhian spinning wheel which had adorned the Congress Party's flag. This wasn't quite American-style separation of church and state. In that model, there's a wall between religion and the state itself. But Indian secularism generally sought to sustain and promote all of India's various religions. This was much more complicated in some ways, with communally-based schools and different codes of law. At times, there was a tension between democratic society and an allegiance to community, which was fostered by the state itself. But India was first and foremost committed to representative democracy. And in 1951 and 1952 in the winter, India held its first general elections with universal adult suffrage. By the time of independence, Indians were deeply committed to the idea that they should vote. That was the way to bring government into office. And Nehru really didn't deviate from this principle during his time in office, and really, for the most part, neither did his successors. Holding a free election on this scale with almost 200 million people participating was unprecedented in human history. It was completed successfully, and this was a testimony to the deep political training and practice that Indians had had in the later decades of colonial rule, particularly in the elections of 1937 and 1946. In the 1951-52 elections, people traveled even to the most remote villages of India to ensure that the greatest number of people got to vote. Congress did extremely well during that first election. They continued to rule at the national and state levels. After the first election, the party won 364 of 489 seats in the parliament. Congress had really wrapped itself up in the image of Mahatma Gandhi and the notion that it was this party which had brought India to independence. Not everyone, though, admired the Congress. Congress really secured only the support of around 45% of the votes cast, and the remainder of Indian votes were split among different opposition parties. Right-wing, left-wing, regional, language-based. And so it meant that while lots of different parties were pushed to the margins, there were big agendas that weren't being met by the center. There was a disjuncture between the Congress party's limited appeal and its domination of the legislature. This would be a feature of Indian politics for years to come, but it would begin to break by the 1990s and the early 2000s. But however we think about politics in independent India, it's clear that its first 2 decades were really the age of Nehru. Nehru was the glue that held India together. He was the inspiring vision that helped India see through the different challenges of the day. A commitment to economic development, a struggle to contain separatism. Nehru had rivals within the Congress Party. He had fended off different challenges from the left and after independence from the right. But basically, after 1950, he remained secure as the Congress Party chairman until his death in 1964. Nehru had unquestioned strength, but he wasn't a ruthless or vindictive ruler, and he governed very directly with the administrative services in a collaborative model. He was widely admired during his life. He was described as Panditji, and he was a charming figure. He always wore a rose in his sherwani. He was the representative of independent India to itself, but also to the world at large. He was a popular figure on the world stage. Nehru also had a concrete role in the planning of India with his vision for architecture. This took place most directly in Punjab. After partition, India had lost Punjab's old capital of Lahore to Pakistan, and it was clear that East Punjab needed a new capital. Nehru believed that this was an opportunity to develop a wholly new Indian city, one that he wrote would be symbolic of the freedom of India, unfettered by the traditions of the past, an expression of the nation's faith in the future. None of the old models of architecture could do, not colonial architecture, nor the kind of Indo-Saracenic architecture, which was Delhi's unique colonial style. In some places, like in Bhubaneswar, there was a new kind of Hindu architecture being employed by state governments, but Nehru didn't think that that would do either. Instead, Nehru turned to an internationally renowned French architect, Le Corbusier, and Le Corbusier designed a new city called Chandigarh. It was a starkly modernist city. Its buildings were shaped by sweeping lines, they were painted in bold colors, and the street was divided on a modern grid. Everything from roads to parks to residences for different classes of people and civil servants were laid out in detail. Chandigarh wasn't an immediately popular city. Architects seemed to like it more than Indians did. It came under fire for its disregard of Indian conditions. It was too sprawling, it was too foreboding, it was remote from Indian life. But it's important to look at Chandigarh as just a symbol of how Nehru wanted to construct an India that would be fit for the modern world in the second half of the 20th century. It's actually possible to see this influence of Nehru in the Indian cinema of the 1950s. Since the 1900s, there had been films that were being made in Bombay and elsewhere. But the film studio system that came up in Bombay by the 1940s and 1950s, known as Bollywood, was deeply connected to the political trajectories of the new state. There was film music everywhere in the air. First it was on radio, and then it was on records and cassette tapes. A lot of these movies were just escapist or romance. But there was also a lot of treatment in these new Bollywood films of nationalism, the challenges of development in modern life. There were a lot of popular films that showed stars portraying the modern Indian who would place nation before self. One of the most famous films, Shri 420, came out in 1955. It's a parable of Indian modernity, and one of India's best-known songs celebrates the hero's national identity.
मेरा जूता है जापानी ये पतलून इंग्लिस्तानी सर पे लाल टोपी रूसी फिर भी दिल है हिंदुस्तानी.
As you can see, Raj Kapoor is borrowing here from Charlie Chaplin. And he's scrappy, and he has to import many of his things, but fundamentally, his heart is Hindustani or Indian. This is a real Nehruvian vision. You could also look to a movie like Mughal-e-Azam, which came out in 1960. This was a parable that was about the Emperor Akbar, but he stood in for Nehru, ruling over a land where Hindu and Muslim lived happily together, and personal desires were sacrificed for the good of the overall country. There was a new political order taking place in independent India. The political system of the 1950s tied Nehru's leadership to local politics. Nehru had campaigned successfully. He set the vision and tone for India, but he could only exercise his authority and political strength through an organized party. And the Congress Party could offer just that. Through the work of Gandhi and others, Congress had become a powerful organization that reached deep into every Indian village. From the 1930s onwards, Congress had been turned from an agitation machine into a vote-getting body. In the 1950s, Nehru was on top of that organization, but he didn't always control everything about it. He was surrounded by more conservative party organizers whose power was embedded in the control that they had over state and district level party organization. In a similar fashion, there were state chief ministers who responded to Nehru in New Delhi at the center, but they were pretty autonomous in how they exercised power in their states. This was how the Congress system worked. Party bosses would give out jobs or development funds to lower-level Congress workers in the districts, and they would move these funds to the controllers of vote banks in these villages. Basically, Congress was trading patronage for votes. This was boss politics, but it wasn't the only kind of politics at work in 1950s India. Right after the Indian Constitution was ratified, Nehru had to deal with a major demand for the reorganization of India's provinces. This was really a colonial problem that now independent India had to deal with. As the British had developed their provinces and sorted out many different princely states, they really had only taken in mind their administrative convenience and the political needs of the moment. This meant that speakers of different languages were divided across provinces. This was most notable among speakers of Oriya and Telugu. And there were other states that were multilinguistic and large, provinces like Madras and Bombay. After 1947, more arbitrary units were brought into the fold of independent India. There were some that were huge, like Mysore and Hyderabad, and there were some that were simply confusing administrative structures, like the state of Madhya Bharat in central India. In the 1920s, as part of restructuring the Congress, Gandhi had set up provincial Congress committees along linguistic lines, dividing the groups along what languages they spoke. He reasoned that by speaking to people in their own language, Congress could become more responsive to the needs of its different people. After independence, it seemed possible to translate this into a reorganization of states. But Nehru didn't seem to want this. After partition, he was nervous about encouraging anything that would feel like it could be conducive to separatism. Throughout his time in office, really until his death in 1964, Nehru was most concerned with maintaining the territorial integrity of India. But he was a democratic ruler, and he couldn't ignore a growing demand for states that were reorganized around what language people spoke in them. This began with the Telugu-speaking people, who had been deeply upset in colonial rule that Tamil speakers in the multilinguistic Madras province had gotten all the good jobs and gotten better access to education. Even before independence, they had been working to get their own state. Nehru too had objected to this demand. And in October 1952, the Andhra Telugu-speaking leader Potti Sriramalu began a fast on to his death. Unlike Gandhi, who had frequently done this, Potti Sriramalu actually died. 3 days later, the government agreed that they would finally establish an Andhra state for Telugu speakers. Once this process had begun, it really couldn't be stopped. There was a states reorganization committee that was set up, and in 1956, its report brought into existence a completely reorganized India. It was divided into 14 states on the basis of language. There was Kerala established for Malayalam speakers. Mysore was for Kannada speakers. Madras, later called Tamil Nadu, was home for Tamil speakers. Some states were unaffected by this, like the populous Hindi-speaking states of the United Provinces, or as it was later called, Uttar Pradesh, as well as Bihar or West Bengal. But there were 6 new union territories created. You can see this if you look on an Indian banknotes. There's all 14 official languages of India. The Nehru government tried to exempt 2 different states from this, Bombay and Punjab. Bombay Presidency had had 2 clearly demarcated linguistic regions. There was Gujarati speakers in the north and Marathi speakers in the south. But its biggest city and metropolitan center, the city of Bombay, was mixed. Gujaratis dominated trade and industry, but the majority of working class people were Marathi speakers. This was doomed from the beginning, and there were 2 political parties that sprang into existence to demand a separate state for Marathi speakers. Finally, in 1960, this happened. Gujarat was separated from the state of Maharashtra. Punjab was even harder. There were Punjabi speakers, Hindi speakers, and Sikhs. Sikhs dominated the Punjabi-speaking portion of the state. They were organizing for a Punjabi-speaking state, but this was soon perceived as a demand for a Sikh homeland. And Nehru didn't want to create any state based on religious conviction after what had happened during partition. This would have to wait until Nehru's death. In 1966, there was a Punjabi-speaking state of Punjab that was created, and the Hindi-speaking areas of that state were reorganized into two new states, of Haryana and the mountainous Himachal Pradesh. It was unclear what Sikhs' role would be in the new government structure, and that would come back to haunt the central government throughout the 1980s. There was one final administrative problem that needed to be solved. After Britain had departed, two European powers remained on the Indian subcontinent. France still had its territory of Pondicherry, but it was persuaded to hand it over relatively quickly. But Portugal had been in Goa for 450 years, and it resisted being incorporated into independent India. In 1959, Nehru marched the Indian army into the territory in something called Operation Vijay. He defeated the Portuguese who were there, and finally incorporated Goa and a few other territories into the Indian Union. Both of these places remained culturally distinct, shaped by different colonial histories, but finally now they were part of a whole Indian Union. We're going to come back very soon to the big questions of poverty and economic development in independent India. But for now, we can just say that even before independence, India's leaders had asserted that one of their biggest tasks would be to move India's economy forward, to break the economic backwardness that had characterized and was the result of colonial experience. Congress had been able, before independence, to suppress class politics in favor of a shared goal of removing the British. But as independence came, it became harder and harder to contain those who wanted more radical social change. The biggest opposition came from the left. There was, of course, the Congress Socialist Party and then the Communist Party of India, who were linked to the Soviet Union. At independence, both of these parties were agitating for India to move further and further to the left in its politics. Nehru was a socialist. He had long proclaimed that, but he was a more moderate kind of socialist. He sometimes described himself as Fabian, kind of European style. He was sympathetic to the Congress Socialist group, but he never explicitly was part of it. But increasingly, Nehru seemed to believe in the urgent necessity of an equitable social order in independent India, and it led him to support more and more active and progressive measures on behalf of state control of the economy and the project of agrarian land reform. In 1955, the Congress Party, under Nehru's direction, committed itself formally to the principle that planning in India should take place with a view to the establishment of a socialistic pattern of society, where the principal means of production are under social ownership or control. This was a pretty strong embrace of socialist policies. One scheme that held out a lot of appeal to India's congressmen was the project of cooperative farming. Indians were inspired by the example of what they saw going on in China, where peasants were being collectivized. This had some pretty tragic consequences in China, but they weren't apparent to Indians at the time. In 1959, Nehru helped the Congress push through a resolution that called for the establishment of cooperative joint farming in India along Chinese lines. But this was a big challenge to India's landed castes, and they worked to defeat this very aggressively. Maybe more long-lasting was Nehru's faith in the institution of a planned economy. In 1950, Nehru established a planning commission that would formulate 5-year plans meant at forwarding India's development. This was a model that was lifted directly from the Soviet Union and China. The socialist bloc was big at 5-year plans. India's first 5-year plan, which started in 1951, focused on agricultural development, and the second one focused on boosting India's industrial sector. At the heart of this planning enterprise was a goal to creating a big industrial base for India, mostly creating heavy goods like iron and steel and prioritizing those over consumer goods. There were a lot of problems with these plans, but they did break some of the economic stagnation that had taken place during the 1930s and 1940s. Agricultural production did grow by about 25% in the first plan and 20% in the second. Industrial output also grew into the 1960s. India's national income rose by about 4% a year, though population growth wiped out most of those gains. But there were costs to that development too. Focusing on industry meant that there wasn't a lot of funds to really substantively increase agriculture. And there were a lot of showy industrial projects that soaked up funds when there might have been better ways of spending India's limited foreign exchange earnings. Nehru's insistence that India be self-sufficient in India meant that consumer prices went through the roof. And there were lots of goods that people didn't really want, like the Hindustan Ambassador, which was a beautiful car, but whose design remained unchanged for about 40 years. India's capitalists were tightly regulated, and they complained about it a lot, but they had a domestic market that they could operate in without really that much competition. India's socialist economy under Nehru was never like Mao's China. It never sought to encompass the entire economy, and while there were tons of permits and license and credits that Indian businessmen needed to operate, it didn't really touch the world of the small trader or the moneylender. In many ways, there was a heavily regulated market sector and a much larger unorganized economy. We're going to come back to that soon when we talk about the Republic of India and its efforts to promote growth in the 1980s and 1990s. Before that, we're going to turn our attention to India's neighbors, the new nation of Pakistan and later Bangladesh. Then we're going to talk a little bit about caste and those politics. There's a lot of ground to cover, so stay tuned. I look forward to seeing you soon.